My earlier summary of head and neck surgery, as I saw it back in the 70s and 80s, was a bit like my experience with skiing. I took up skiing in my late 30s, early 40s, and it was like preparing for surgery, dressing up for skiing. You went with your poles and your skis, you went up to the top of the hill, you put your skis on, you went flying down the hill, partially in control and partially out of control. But if you got down to the bottom altogether, you took off your skis, got back on the lift and went back up to the top of the hill and started again.
Good morning, Professor Patrick Bradley from Nottingham. Lovely to see you, Patrick. I'm going to just say a few words about how I know you, and then you perhaps say a few words about how you know me, and then I'm going to interview you about your professional career. So I first met you in 1984 when I came up as a junior doctor to Nottingham. I think you'd been a consultant for a couple of years already, and I was the first trainee that you appointed as opposed to inherited. And I had the great privilege of working with you for the next 4 to 5 years. And since then, I'm delighted to say we've been close friends. You were a mentor to me and now a friend and colleague and a very supportive senior surgeon. I worked with you training in head and neck, and then when I became a consultant, I didn't do so much head and neck, but our friendship has remained solid, and I very much value our relationship. So it's a pleasure to be able to interview you today, Patrick, and I hope that this will go smoothly.
Well, Tony, thank you for being volunteered, if not volunteering, to do this interview. As you say, we did meet in your formative years when you immigrated from London and came up into the countryside to see what ENT could do for you. I met you when you interviewed as a registrar with the Nottingham Leicester rotation in 1984. And I still remember that interview when one of the interview panel said whether I would be working for Tony Narula or Tony Narula would be working for me. And having just started as a consultant, I had to say I didn't really care one way or the other as to whether who was working for who. But as you know yourself, we got on very well. I was new to the system. I was new to a new job, my first consultant post. I think I was 32 years of age. I had been exploded through ENT, having done general surgery before that. And my major interest was in head and neck cancer. That was the major reason why I ended up in Nottingham, because they were looking for a head and neck surgeon. And without going into the previous history, really, ENT didn't do much head and neck. It gave it all away to the plastic surgeons. And Kevin Gibbon, my senior, was of a notion at that time that ENT needed to super specialize within a big teaching hospital, and hence I was encouraged to apply. And we've remained friends ever since.
Well, I learned a lot from you, Patrick. I learned the virtues of working very hard. I learned how to always question the evidence and challenge it. And I learned from you that if other people challenge, you either have to have facts at your fingertips or you should be open to the challenge. And I learned all that from you. And I hope we'll come into teaching later, but I hope that those things you taught me, they've certainly stood me in good stead. And I hope I've passed them on to some of my trainees in my 30 years as a consultant. So moving on to the depth of the interview. Tell me, Patrick, how did you end up becoming a medical student in the first place? Because your family is not medical, is it? What was the motivation there?
My mother always said that I wanted to be a doctor, but I can't recall ever being impressed by any doctors, including general practitioners, that I ever met. When I left school, or before I left school, I was in a Benedictine boarding school, where really, if I put it, my leaving class when I left in 6th year had 20 students. So we were fairly protected. The headmaster did say, if you didn't do medicine, what else would you do? So I considered doing computer engineering or computer science. And I was good at mathematics, and I considered and got a place in the London School of Actuary. But when I came to Dublin, which happened 2 years before I left school, because my dad was promoted within the Irish Sugar Company to being managing director. When I went to medical school, really, I felt so happier there. It was kind of security, and I was living at home with my mother, so I had all the comforts, and the medical school was only 2 miles down the road. And hence I stayed in medical school for 6 years and enjoyed it.
So moving into medical school, tell us a little bit about how you ended up, first of all, wanting to do surgery as a whole, and then we might come later to how you moved from surgery as a whole into ENT head and neck. So tell me about your drive to be a surgeon.
The drive to be a surgeon was really kind of dexterity and handyman, and not that I'm a great handyman, but I felt that physicians were thinkers. And my experience as a medical student was that they more or less saw the same patients again and again and again and again, and none of them were ever discharged, i.e. in inverted commas, cured. Whereas the surgeons were much more decisive, make a decision, execute whatever, and then discharge the patient on the assumption they were cured, of course. Or alternatively, to discharge them, having made a decision their intervention wasn't going to work. And I was impressed with that. And again, while I was an intern, I had a mentor or a surgeon who did some head and neck surgery, i.e. thyroid, parathyroids, parotids. And he was the one that really encouraged me to consider doing ENT. But like everything else, doing ENT necessitated doing a surgical training program. So I got into the College of Surgeons of Dublin registrar training program, where I did 2 years as a registrar. And out of that, I got my FRCS from Ireland. And towards the end of that, then a decision had to be made whether I would continue in general surgery or move on to some other subspecialty. I was offered an MD by the professor of surgery in pancreatic transplant, but somehow he didn't outlive me. I outlived him, and it so turned out, sadly, he passed away before I could make a decision. But again, part of that problem, I suppose, was we were already married. We had one child. There was no income for being a researcher. So in the end, my career moved towards ENT. And at the time, I was advised to go to England or go to America for training, mainly to be a head and neck surgeon. And as turned out, a job appeared in Liverpool, i.e. Philip Stell, who was my mentor and my hero, really. He came to Dublin and interviewed me in a hotel in Ireland, should I say in the bar, with his wife. And he offered me a job after 3 minutes. And hence my interview career into ENT was secured for life.
Well, Patrick, you went to Liverpool to do your first ENT job, so that would be at a pretty junior level. And then how did you move through the ranks from SHO to registrar and senior registrar?
Well, days? Yes, okay. My junior ranks was a 6-week secondment to the Eye and Ear Hospital in Dublin, where I had finished my FRCS in June, and the job in Liverpool was November. So I did a 6-week casualty locum in the Eye and Ear Hospital, where I attended clinics, theatre, and had holidays before I went to Liverpool. Philip Stell always said, make sure you're able to put the mirror on the right way up rather than upside down. And that was all I was asked to do. So when I turned up to Liverpool, I was the registrar, having had an FRCS. and your colleague and mine, Max McCormick, was my SHO, who knew as little ENT as I did. So the pair of us were actually Darby and Joan, or Mutt and Jeff, or any duo at all. We lived very close to the hospital, and really we were there most of the time, gaining experience as a very junior registrar. And luckily I did 2 years as a registrar and got promoted to senior registrar when Tony Wright, another one of our friends, he went off to do a PhD. I did his locum for a year and got my ENT fellowship then, and then was promoted to senior registrar.
So how long did you do? 2 years as a reg, and how long did you do as a senior registrar?
Just less than 2.5 before I came out. You wouldn't do that anymore.
You wouldn't be approved, no. So then you referred in the introduction to the fact that you moved to Nottingham in the early 1980s with a sort of a brief to perhaps develop head and neck surgery. But when you went there, because I met you not long after you went there, it was still a case of all the 4 consultants did pretty much everything that came through the door, from stapedectomy to laryngectomy. So how did you go about creating an environment where head and neck surgery could become a specialized super specialism, and that you would be the leader of that particular branch? How did that work for you? What were the pitfalls and what were the techniques you used to make this happen?
The reason I went to Nottingham was, as Philip Stell said, if you don't get a job doing head and neck, you're not going to be an ENT surgeon. I didn't have any inheritance to get back to Ireland, so I was really left stranded. So when the job came up in Liverpool or in Nottingham, Kevin Gibbon was my senior, who was an otologist, a pediatrician. He would do head and neck as well, as you said, as did the other 2. There was a department of 4. But Kevin, being the ambitious one, felt that ENT giving away its head and neck surgery to plastic surgeons was really not terribly specialized. The general surgeons, of course, within the hospital were happily taking anything out, parotids, neck lumps, thyroids, and sending patients directly to radiotherapy. But at the same time, David Morgan, the radiotherapist who worked with me, had just come back from Paris, where he had spent a year doing head and neck cancer. And he was keen to ally with me to develop a head and neck service. At the same time, Ken McClellan came up from London, and he was a lymphoma pathologist interested in head and neck. So I now had a medical team who was ready to work. You arrived at the time and you were the man on the ground, and you actually found us patients circuitously and desirably. I mean, the simple thing, as you did early on, was you created a tracheostomy service for intensive care. ENT never looked for that work. You offered that work. It was usually done on my list. That didn't matter. But we then made our colleagues aware that we were prepared to do work. Subsequent to that, having set my stall out, I then had an argument with the general surgeons. I wanted to change my title from being a consultant ENT surgeon to a consultant head and neck oncologic surgeon. The professor of surgery did not like that. He thought I was trying to stop the surgeons doing anything above the clavicle, of course, which I suppose I was. But at the same time, one of their surgeons, of course, felt I threatened him that I would take all his thyroid practice. This was quite an anomaly because in Liverpool, we didn't do any thyroid because it was done by the general surgeons. So he approached me to say, if he would give me all his neck lumps and his parotid lumps, would I give him all my thyroids? So I was on a winner. I didn't want to do them anyway because I hadn't practiced doing thyroid surgery. So he then started to give me parotid lumps, which he got from his colleague, general surgeons. So again, I was quids in for the time being. As you said, or as I alluded to, there were 4 ENT surgeons. Kevin was my senior. There were 2 senior guys who were old school head and neck or ENT surgeons. They did everything and anything. and sometimes nothing. But they were reluctant to give away their cancer early on. So with Kevin's approval, any subsequent appointment that we got in Nottingham had head and neck cancer taken out of their contract. And as, again, you will know, but I should explain, the next replacement was a neuro-otologist, a pediatrician who did cochlear implants. And then the second replacement was brought in by an endoscopic sinus surgeon who had trained as a head and neck surgeon and a free flapper, but he was told that we didn't need him in head and neck, he should become a rhinologist. So by 93, we had replaced an old school ENT service to a super specialized service to which ENT surgeons referred to one another the difficult problems that we had that we were not prepared to manage. And as a result, we became recognized, I think, in the country as being forward-thinking, innovative, and we really had no problem with getting cases from outside our region, which made work even more difficult. But equally, within the department, Kevin had manipulated money to come from the Midlands Institute of Otology, which then allowed us to appoint a professor. We appointed a professor in 1983 as an otologist and an acoustic neuroma surgeon to lead the research, and subsequently a senior lecturer was appointed. So by 1994-5, there was now 6 of us, having started off as 4, which meant that we all had our own special interest, worked together as a team, and became nationally and internationally recognized for what we did.
Well, let's touch on that, because as you described, it took about 10 years to get this properly bedded in. You were a pioneer in the multidisciplinary team. I remember attending early meetings where everybody would be in the room and the patients were discussed and everybody was allowed to have a view, which was not always the case in those days. And you had a very top-notch speech therapist, Miss Robinson. So you had a good team of nurses, speech therapists, etc. But you did become famous both nationally and internationally. So how did the, one would almost say you had a bit of a travel bug. How did that come about? Because initially you hadn't worked in the US, as you explained, you came to England. You didn't have links particularly with Canada or the Far East or anywhere. How did this come about? And tell us a little bit about your experiences of teaching and traveling.
One's got to remember that the medical profession in the United Kingdom was mainly sited in big metropolis like London, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Glasgow, whatever. Nottingham was a modern red brick capitals or provincial city. We were declared a city in 1890 with Queen Victoria. We had a medical school in 1973. We were the first medical school in the 21st century in the United Kingdom. So we had now come of age. So the British system, or the United Kingdom system, really had no organization other than the Royal Society of Medicine, in which most of our ENT affiliation for education, training, etc. Our association was pretty poor in education at that time. So I took off and went to America. I got involved with the Americans mainly through colleagues I knew from Australia. As you know, most of the convicts from Ireland were sent to Australia. Most of these lads out there were 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation, all did ENT, and they all went to America for their education for the same reason as I did. And luckily we got involved with a ski meeting in Colorado, which was a 10-day meeting, skiing and discussing head and neck. That's where I got to know a lot of American head and neck surgeons at the time, up and coming as well as established. I then joined most of the American head and neck related societies, bronchosophageal, laryngologic, and all those. And I've remained associated with them and with the American Academy. as time went on, the British system and our recognition, I was then, as you know, made president of Laryngologic and Rhinologic Society, or Rhinologic section of the Royal Society of Medicine in 1998-99. That was before the millennium. I think I was still the youngest president of that section in Yonks. But that was because I had become known for teaching and travel, I'm afraid. Travel, of course, was not funded by anybody other than my private practice. We didn't have research funds. We'd also set up a head and neck rehabilitation seminar, which was run by our speech therapists and our nutritionalists. And that equally allowed me to invite American experts to come and lecture at those meetings. And latterly, then the Europeans started to do that. And I got very involved with European Laryngologic Laryngologic Society, the European Head and Neck Society, the European Salivary Gland Society, all of those societies I've been president of, simply because I had the time, or I made the time, probably made the time rather than had the time, because most of this needed to be funded. And while my wife was a doctor, we had 5 children, so we had to look after them as well. So my private practice really went to fund my travel. Because I had set up a specialized service, and this is getting back to self-motivation, I now had a unique practice of head and neck. I saw all the patients, they were all mine. So I kept data on all my own patients. The health service was not terribly good at doing that. So I had little cards and we figured it all out. It never really got computerized, but I could talk about my own experience. And that, in a way, committed me to travel to tell people what I did and what I would do and why I did what I did. And people found that fascinating. I wasn't following protocol. I was following published evidence that I could find. It was mainly American, I would agree. But the facilities that we had in the health service at times hampered that with things like PET scan, MRI scans, etc. But again, you came down to the same principles about management. I think at the same time, you remember I couldn't get palliative care to help me with my head and neck patients. And in the end, my colleagues allowed me to run a palliative care service from my own beds, mainly at the weekend. That was both political and strategic, because if we didn't fill our beds at the weekends, they were filled with general medical patients who would usually block our beds anyway. So I used my surgical beds for palliative care Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and patients were unceremoniously told they had to go home on Sunday in order for my colleagues to work. But that worked out very well for me. And that was self-driven, and with registrars like you, we're very keen to work with that philosophy. Again, we brought on our speech therapists, our nutritionists, our nurses, in fact, were fantastic in my service to help me run a service that they thought was second to none. They were delighted to work late, work nights, work weekends. As you remember, my surgical lists were notorious. We started at 8:30, we finished before the pubs closed, and that was just compulsory closure. We would have stayed working all night if we were allowed. But nowadays you can't do that anymore. So, and that comes back to history, where I had to appoint a second head and neck surgeon in order to fulfill the obligations of theatre time. But that was in the 90s. I was already well established by then and really had moved from being a clinician to being a manager to being an international star, but at the same time ran the service.
Let's just talk about an element of the service that I remember you teaching me. So when you were referred patients by other consultants, whether head and neck consultants, whether general surgeons, and difficult cases where maybe they've already done what they can and treatment has failed, you introduced me to an expression, radical palliation with curative intent. Do you want to just explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, that was a personal, I suppose, collection of words. patients who are sent to you, or even patients with advanced T4, T5, even bigger tumors, they expect you to do something. I felt that in a lot of the practice I saw worldwide, a lot of these patients were given palliative radiation or palliative chemotherapy, or even bad surgery. And I felt that that was really terrible. I mean, you have to become upfront with your patients, and sometimes to tell them, in your opinion, my expertise as a surgeon is not appropriate for your situation as you stand now. It was really with hypopharynx cancer I developed that philosophy of radical palliation with curative intent, because we saw in the early days that patients who couldn't swallow or couldn't breathe would have chemoradiotherapy. What they wanted was to be able to swallow and able to breathe. So I felt that if we could operate, again, with curative intent, i.e. the surgery had not metastasized to the chest. I had a thoracic surgeon at the City Hospital, an Egyptian chap called Salama. He and I had the same philosophy: do a pharyngo-laryngoesophagectomy with a gastric pull-up, then post-op radiation, and send those patients home. Dave Morgan agreed to that, and we ended up having nearly a 40% 3-year survival of those patients, which is more than they would have got in the past. For the other philosophies or the other sites, it became even more difficult. With maxillary sinus surgery, you're entering into the brain, and at that time, we hadn't developed the techniques which Nick Jones brought with us with the endoscopic sinus surgery, and he took over that element of my practice. And Jerry O'Donoghue, who was my neurotologist, took on the temporal bone end. So really, we consolidated what a head and neck surgeon, a modern head and neck surgeon, did with support from his other super specialists.
Okay.
I was not a great believer in chemotherapy. Yes, it has moved on from where I was back in the 80s and 90s. I'm not sure it's a cure-all, but certainly there is need to investigate that. And our practice in Nottingham was certainly not big enough to have a look at that scientifically.
Okay, so you had lateral skull base and anterior as strings to your bow. Let's just go back to travel. I mean, you had so many invitations to speak around the world, and your sort of prestige is almost unrivaled. I wonder whether if I picked out your Myers lecture, would that count as one of the most prestigious invitations that you'd had in the American Academy of Otolaryngology?
Well, yeah. Well, having joined the American ENT head and neck societies in the early 80s through contacts that I knew, the Americans have that kind of selectivity. I've in the end felt, well, you'll never join them, but at least you can get their information and attend and get invited to attend. But I met Gene Myers and his wife Barbara traveling the world as much as I did. And he got to understand the nuances of the United Kingdom health service, if I put it that way. Restricted money, large practices, you could work as much as you want, you got paid a certain amount. Private practice didn't attract head and neck cancer, though it did attract symptoms. So when the Myers lecture came to me, and I was the 5th Myers lecturer, I was the second. Arnie Moran had done the lecture before me from Edinburgh, but I was the 5th Myers lecturer in the world. It's now gone on to 15, so I'm still well. But Gene Myers understood my philosophy and heard my philosophy on hypopharynx cancer, which was the topic of my lecture. Nobody had done it before, but I had been to the American Academy before, and the Myers lecture was first thing and only lecture at 8:30 on a Thursday morning. So everybody who turned up at 8:30, there was only one lecture to go to. So they went to the Myers lecture. And I can tell you, standing on that podium with people standing at an open door because there were no more seats terrified the life out of me. And here I was trying to tell the Americans how to suck eggs. But I came across with my philosophy of palliation, which I think they couldn't practice in America, but at least they came and recognized that. Yes, that was one of the highlights. And the great advantage, of course, to that was Sheena came with me. We were put up in a rooftop penthouse. We got our flights paid. We had taxis to drive us around Washington, D.C. for the best part of a week. It was wonderful.
Pat, let's move on to another very large part of your professional life. We've talked a bit about your international travel and a little bit about your teaching, but you've done so much more in the world of publication, scientific publications. I mean, starting off with simply publishing original articles, then moving on to editorships, textbooks, etc. You've done so much. How do you cope with all this, this sort of publishing while you were still in practice? It's different for people who are retired, but you did it while you were in full-time practice. How did you manage it?
You just make time. There is time. Well, Sheena, my wife, is a radiologist. She enjoyed her career being a classmate. I'm sure we'll come back to that. I had 5 kids. Sheena had got them organized in such a way that she could go to work and I could go to work. I went to work 7 days a week and she went to work 5 days a week. I just enjoyed reading, and I was not a natural writer, and I probably was never a natural editor. I felt that my efforts at writing, certainly at the beginning of my career, was bloody hard work, if I put it that way. Stell was a great man for cutting out the words and moving around and making what seemed like a big sentence into just a few words. I felt that I owed that to future trainees to get their manuscripts and correct and edit. And most of my trainees got tired giving me back drafts of papers that I corrected. And one of the jokes was, if it went round long enough, you'd end up with the same manuscript you sent 3 months ago. What I got irritated a bit about was that everybody would volunteer. And I used to have the phrase, you can't publish promises. Everybody would love to have a curriculum vitae full of publications, but it takes hard work, either your work or your team's work. Now, I hate an article with 7 authors. It means nobody did the work. You have to have one guy at the beginning and one guy near the end. And I run one journal which has only 3 authors on every article that's published, because you don't need more than 3. So because of that, I then became on a lot of editorial boards and enjoyed that. And I mean, I'm on 4 of the American head and neck journals. I was on the editorial board in my life. I'm still on head and neck surgery, which started in 1982, I think, and I'm still on the editorial board even now, 40 years later, still on that editorial. I love it. I did get caught at times trying to become an editor when the publisher was not as keen on dedicated workers as I was. He promised me that the editorial board would work for nothing and the contributors would publish for nothing. After I got an editorial board together, he then changed his tack and changed his mind and said, well, people would have to pay, he'd like this, $900 to have a case report published on the internet. I withdrew my sponsorship as editor and I withdrew the whole of the editorial board from that publisher. He has never replaced me or any of the board to run that section of his journal. I just felt that was the wrong way.
I seem to remember that.
You can get most decent articles published for nothing.
Yes.
There's no reason in God's earth why you should pay money to get an article published.
So just moving on, Pat, I know that you were inspired by your mentor, Philip Stell, the late Philip Stell from Liverpool, who I think we can both agree was a great intellect and surgeon and teacher. But very few of his trainees, as far as I can see, went on to become head and neck surgeons in the same way that he was. But you've had a different experience, haven't you? Tell me about people you've trained who've ended up in head and neck, and how you keep in touch with them.
Philipsdale, when I was there in the late 70s, started to bring in fellows. Got some from Australia, got some from New Zealand, got some from Europe. He was a linguist, so he enjoyed speaking different languages to them, including Spanish and French. And he would give lectures in French and Spanish, etc. And they got the bulk of the training, mainly because in the rotation, people only spent 6 months of a 3-year rotation with Philipsdale. When I went to Philipsdale, I went to be a head and neck surgeon. I did not do the complete training of an ENT registrar in Liverpool. Yes, I did jobs, but I mainly did head and neck. And that was really the reason he did say to me, if you don't get a head and neck job, I don't know what you're going to do. Yeah, I think we could all say, yes, you could be an ENT surgeon within it, but you wouldn't be terribly happy. It was after I left was a number of Stell's trainees like Nick Rowland, Sean Jackson, did become head and neck surgeons in the Liverpool area, and they are dedicated head and neck surgeons. But I agree, most of the other ones, Charles Vyse, a lot of the Irish guys went back to Ireland or went to district general hospitals in England and ran a service like was run in Nottingham. They did a bit of everything and certainly didn't centralize their services. A lot of Stell's fellows all went away to become heads of service in their own countries, like Randall Morton, Franz Massotten, they'll come to mind. They all went away and ran a head and neck service like was produced in Nottingham or in Liverpool at the time. Stell himself, I think, worked very hard to achieve what he did achieve. Sadly, ill health stopped him in his career. And then he took off and did another career in anthropology and social history, and he enjoyed that. He never got his just rewards for having been an ENT surgeon and a pathfinder. Most of his rewards were for his historical work that he did in York University, sadly.
What about your trainees who done head and neck? You've got a little you have a little get together once a year.
Yeah, we when I trained, I think it was yourself or somebody else said to me, Pat, you've never been in a traveling club, which seems to be a very British thing to have. But to be in a traveling club, 1, you have to be invited. 2, your wife has to come with you. And 3, you probably are meeting friends that you don't particularly want to meet. I had my own traveling club and I could bring Sheena wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted, and pay for her. So I was much more independent. At one time, you and I remember we went for 6 weeks to Australia. I mean, I could go and come as I pleased. Again, you couldn't do that nowadays. Otherwise, somebody would want to know how are you drawing salary. But I never had arguments with the management staff as to how much work I did and what my delivery was. So I'm afraid they turned a blind eye more or less to me and felt that you couldn't get somebody else working as hard as I did when I was there. Now, I know one manager said, if you're here more often, we'd actually get more work out of you. I'm afraid I had to castigate that lady and say, if you had me working as hard all the time, I wouldn't be here at all. And the discussion disappeared. But as you know, in the second triage of my year, I went into hospital management on top of my clinical work and did an MBA, Master of Business Administration, at the behest of my managing director, or CEO. And And really, in the end, I never took up that senior management offer simply because I was classified as a very doctor manager rather than a manager's manager. And I'm ever so grateful I didn't get into higher management because it would have borne the socks off me. But getting back to where we were, yes, I have identified and trained about 10, 12, 14 younger trainees through my ranks, and all have gone on to run a head and neck service, either single-handed or incorporated with other groups, which to me is a great credit. And we meet once a year and we have a dinner, and I keep up to date with them and they kind of get old with me. But it is fun to talk to them and get to know them, and they recognize, I think, the bit I did to motivate them to work hard when they worked and play hard when you're not. But, you know, you could fit a lot into work when you're working if you really want to, you know, prioritize your working. I think we spend a lot of time thinking when we don't really need to think when you're at work.
Well, talking about the complexities of some of the things you've done, you have referred a couple of times already to your wife, Dr. Sheena Bradley, who is herself or was until retirement, a consultant radiologist. I mean, she must be very tolerant to put up with you working 7 days a week. And I know from personal experience that genuinely was 7 days a week. It wasn't 5 days pretending to be 7. So she must be remarkably tolerant of your foibles.
I should get her in to answer that question. Yes, Sheena was a medical school classmate. We interned together with the professor of surgery. We were on a 1 and 2 with the professor of surgery. We weren't allowed to work together under the professor of medicine because we'd already worked with the professor of surgery. She then ended up working really, because we got married in 1974, 1 year after qualifying, and we had 2 babies fairly quickly. So she had a family ready-made, and she worked around that between general practice, house physician in an orthopedic hospital for, I think, 4 years, 5 years. Then when I went to Liverpool, she got a research job. She was always working. She found a job to fulfill her medical career. When I got the job here in Nottingham, she came over here and started in radiology. And then, having got her FRCS in radiology, rather than working in Nottingham, she said we couldn't work together. She ended up in Grantham as a single-handed radiologist for 12 years, if I remember right. So she worked her own job in her own way. But the whole time she gave me leeway, as you would put it. As long as I was happy and not in her hair, I think she was quite happy to let me off. I mean, when she finished, I finished because of ill health. She retired before me. We had decided we would go at 60. She's now done a BA and an MA in poetry and short stories. So she's still ambitious in her own way. So, as she would put it, if you're not in my hair, I'm not in your hair, and the kids won't be in anybody's hair as long as they look after themselves. And the kids have done well. I think we're proud enough of them. Paulo did a bit of ENT for a while now in general practice. Dara's in Japan. We have kids here. They're all happy. I'm sure, like everything else, in retrospect, we could have done more for them. But I think they emulated kind of what we had done for them and have turned out good kids. But yes, my wife is a saint.
Oh, Pat, I think that all those of us who know Sheena would have to acknowledge her role in supporting your career. I think there is a phrase, Pat, behind every successful man, there's a very surprised woman. But in your case, I don't think she's surprised at all. Now, moving on, we've had a very fruitful discussion. This, of course, is mainly for the benefit of the Taiwan Head and Neck Society. Now, as we do the interview, there are political problems in Taiwan in relation to their larger neighbor. But what is your relationship with the Taiwan Head and Neck Society, and what, if any, message would you like to send to them as we wind up the interview?
We come back to the common denominator. Gene Myers was my linchpin meeting the Taiwanese, and he got involved in training Taiwan head and neck surgeons in Pittsburgh. No, it was in Philadelphia. No, it was in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And I met some of them with Gene Myers when we had dinner together at the American Academy. My son, Dara, my older boy, went out to teach English in Japan. He married Japanese, and he's still out there 20 years later. So Sheena and I used to go out to Japan alternate years, and he would come back alternate years. So it became evident to my Taiwan chaps that you're passing Taiwan on the way to Japan. Why wouldn't you call in? And not that I wouldn't be adventurous to call in. It became much more feasible when I had retired in 2009. So I went to Taiwan in 2002, I think 2012 it was, 2014 and 2016. I've been there 3 times. Sheena came with me once, and they look after me superbly. They allow me golf in the morning, a snooze in the afternoon, teach in the evening, and then dinner late at night, and it's all wonderfully well. Their students are like sponges. They are fantastic. They are inquisitive, demanding. When you finish one lecture, they want to know, have you got another one? I tend to, as I'm sure I taught you, why do you do this? If you had, I'd show a clinical picture. What's the diagnosis? How would you manage this? And after a while, they came out of their shell. And what I found was somewhat sad, but typical of residents. They had the answer, which came out of a book, which came out of the boss, but they hadn't got any logic to themselves. Why are you doing it that way? And could you not do it another way? And I enjoy that. And hence, should I say, if they asked me to go tomorrow, I would probably go back to Taiwan on the same conditions as I went before. They're very hospitable. Yes, I understand their sympathies and anger with the neighbors. And it's part of living in Asia, I'm afraid. Suppose we have our own problems here in Europe, but they're nothing like what they've got. They are supported by America and are grateful that they have, because there's not many other friends they have out there from their history, which you probably don't understand and need to understand. But they're lovely people, lovely, friendly people. And I think I get on with them and they get on well with me. And I think because of that, I go back. I'm on the editorial. Yes, they did set up a head and neck research journal. I'm on the editorial board. I've written a couple of reviews for them. It's run by Professor Yen down in Kershaw, who is a lovely, quiet guy, not politically, but is well recognized for his academic work that he does in Taiwan. It was, as I say, through the friendship with Gene Myers that I got to know them. I mean, Gene is a different man than me in that he travels. I'm not sure he did a great deal of work, but he's in his 80s, latter 80s now, still travels with his wife, still gives lectures. It's fun. It's fun to get to travel and to get kind of recognized in its own way internationally. That they've read your articles or have read your book or have read something about you, and kind of putting a picture to it has greater meaning.
Patrick, that's wonderful. And I think one of the things you said in that little piece about the Taiwan Head and Neck Society really struck a chord with me, which was trying to ask people, why do you do that? Why are you doing it this way? What is the evidence? Because I remember that having these discussions with you nearly 40 years ago, and being able to learn so much from you by asking questions. But I do remember that you were never impressed if someone asked a question and they hadn't prepared by doing some reading beforehand. So if I came to you and say, why are you doing it like that? Because I've read X, you would say, okay, when we finished operating, come down to my office and I will show you A, B, C, D, and E, and go and read those tonight. It was a wonderful way to be trained. You were wonderful at setting principles and then training all of us to think. Patrick, it's been a great pleasure to do this interview with you. I'm absolutely thrilled to have been a friend and colleague of yours. I hope for many more years of Bradley Dining Club and other events. I hope that this is just another little pit stop on the way. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to do this interview. All the best, Patrick.
Tony, thank you indeed. Much pleasure. I look forward to meeting you somewhere soon.
Looking forward to it,
Keep
mate.
well.